Think liberty and let freedom ring. President John F. Kennedy sort of said, "We do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because these goals serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. These are challenges we are willing to accept, unwilling to postpone, and which we intend to win." And we at the Think Liberty, Think Freedom podcast echo this very creed. Welcome to On the Air with Dr. John. Good morning out there. I wanted to come back the week after 4th of July week and kind of put into perspective, one, why I'm doing these videos, and two, how they came to be. And then tell a story too with regard to one of the big controversies that we're looking at, which is open borders. Well, first off, during my doctoral journey in education, had a number of courses on philosophy, and one of those courses we dove deep into Marxism and other related philosophies, such as, or spin-offs, if you will, such as liberation pedagogy and liberation theology. Paulo Freire's devices that he used as a revolutionary in Brazil, and actually we see the variant liberation theology being used in what was used in Reverend Wright's church in Chicago, the church that former President Barack Obama attended. At any rate, that dove me into philosophy and looking at a number of the various philosophers throughout the ages, going back and looking at the Greeks as well as some of the mid Renaissance period philosophers such as Hegel, John Locke, and others. And that really kind of opened my eyes to a lot of different thinking. And then what happened, I started teaching a little while ago a course on strategic public relations. And interestingly enough, if you go back to the founding of public relations, well, one might argue that you could go all the way back to Julius Caesar and the way that Caesar publicized stories of his victories in order to ensure that his welcome back in Rome would be greatly anticipated and would cause a lot of positive excitement for the citizenry of Rome. But the modern day really goes back to a gentleman by the name of Edward Bernays, who worked for Woodrow Wilson at the time of the First World War. Bernays was an interesting character. He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud and actually studied under Sigmund Freud for a period of time, went and lived with his uncle. And what Bernays brought to public relations, propaganda, and marketing in general could be described as an understanding of how to apply psychoanalysis to the marketplace, and then also then capitalizing on the herd mentality, if you will, groupthink. Okay, so that's what got me into this. And my first video on this was actually with regard to Edward Bernays, and took a deep dive into Edward Bernays' impact in general. But I've come back with a couple of other videos. I did one where I talked about hey Mick, welcome, good morning. I talked on one of the videos was about the foundational documents, if you will, the Federalist Papers for the Confederacy, and the impact that had on the progressive movement in the United States and how closely they were tied. And then I've also talked about Wilson to a small extent, and then even better yet, we spent 4th of July digging into the Declaration of Independence. Well, I had, and I've made a number of posts, and I've had some questions that were asked, and I want to get into explaining one of those issues, which is really how did communism come about? And everybody knows Marx. Marx was, but nobody really. If I were to ask you, I'll ask you, Mick, since you're there. What do you know about Marx? Well, probably you know that he wrote the Communist Manifesto and maybe another book, Das Kapital. But Marx actually, his imprint is bigger than those two items in that he was part of what is known as the First International, or what we might say actually was titled at the time the International Workingmen's Association, the IWMA. And in that meeting, and it lasted, the international groupings, there were actually three, some might argue there were four, but there's three that we're going to talk about. They weren't a one point in time. They actually occurred over a number of years. So, for example, the International Workingmen's Association was a series of meetings that ran from the early 1860s into the 1870s. I think it was 1879 that it finally broke up. And interestingly enough, at those series of meetings, there were two factions. There was the socialism communist faction, which was signified by Marx. Marx was pretty clever. He was an author back then, and not really big in terms of organizational. This was really, I should come back and say, what started this International Workingmen's Association. One of the trigger events was a Polish uprising that occurred over workers' rights, and it was used to bring all workers together internationally. Well, Marx was an author that had talked about the uprising of the proletariat, but at this meeting he was just one. He was very good though. He managed to get himself into a position where he was the sole person to actually write the notes, and I used to joke when I was teaching data analysis that he who controls the numbers controls the world. Well, that's probably true, but equally true is he who controls the notes controls the narrative. And so Marx was able to control the narrative. And interestingly, there were two factions. Bakunin, who was a Russian, he was an anarchist, and some say that he had roots back to the nihilist movement in Russia, responsible for the assassination of one of the czars. The Bakunin movement were anarchists. They wanted to blow things up from the bottom and then see a proletariat. Well, these two factions, through the course of the First International, they ended up splitting, and the Bakunin sect was seen to have lost because the narrative that was written was actually obviously the Marx version, but they were a much smaller group. They actually were exiled to New York, believe it or not. And Bakunin, much greater group. They went and they had some meetings in Switzerland, but ultimately the First International came to an end, and then we had the Second International. And the Second International ran for a much longer period of time. And interestingly enough, the Bakunin, the anarchists, they kind of faded away. And so now you had the Second International starting in the later part of the 1800s and ran through 1916 into the First World War. When did Marx die? Well, he wasn't part of the Second International. He had already passed away. Engels continued some of his work. And the Second International really focused on trying to understand, should communism come from the top down or should it be from the bottom up? And after the Second International dissolved in 1916, it wasn't until the 20s that the Third Communist International, and a lot of times the third is obviously the most important that we're going to talk about, is the Third Comintern, or Comintern. Communist International was what it was known as. And the Comintern, what happened at the Comintern was that Stalin, by the way, Lenin, who ushered in the Russian Revolution in 1917 in October. There were two Russian revolutions, by the way. One in February, which overthrew the Tsar, and then the second was the overthrow of the Bolsheviks. But not by the proletariat, by the way. The communist revolution, there really was no proletariat in Russia. In Russia, you really had an agrarian society, and you had peasants. Lenin was able to create a revolution with less than 6% of the population. And when you look at his initial grouping, one of the very famous pictures of the Russian communists, it's Lenin. Stalin is in there. I'll tell you a story about Stalin in a moment. And in addition, it was all academics. Now, but academics, this helps explain some of this. And there were some capitalists in there, some members of and some members of the aristocracy. The revolution was really about power, and Lenin was looking for power, and that's what he got. Stalin, by the way, Lenin. Let me come back for a moment. Lenin believed that in order to achieve the revolution, he needed to have great control over the activities of the revolution. And so he created, essentially, his revolutionaries were paid professionals. And who paid them? Well, Joseph Stalin paid them initially. By the way, there were capitalists in Germany that were paying Lenin as well. But Stalin was the treasurer. He was the payroll guy. And Stalin, how did he do this? Well, he did it the way that all thugs would do it. He went out and he robbed banks. So Stalin was a bank robber in the early days of the Russian Revolution, and that's how the Russian Revolution was initially funded. Stalin obviously moved on to bigger things and much bigger roles. He was known as the secretary of the filing cabinet because he kept records on everybody. He knew what everybody did. It was the beginning of the KGB, all the way back then at the beginning of the revolution. At any rate, the Third Comintern, the focus of the Third Comintern was to export communism internationally. The idea of global communism had won out, and so the idea was to export communism everywhere. And interestingly enough, what transpired during that point in time, folks had seen the butchery and the extinction of mass numbers of people. As a matter of fact, we talk about the horrors of the Holocaust, which were huge. But if I were to ask you how many folks that were killed by Lenin and Stalin, would you be able to put a number to it? Most people don't know. It was 20 million people, over 20 million. Plus 20 million people were killed by the communist revolution in Russia. Now, as a result, as global communism was pushing out throughout Europe, there were reactions to it. National socialism in Germany and fascism in Italy. I'm doing another show where I talk about what fascism is, both the literal meaning and the philosophies of fascism later. But let me just say that in order to counter those movements, what Stalin did is he hired paid professional revolutionaries. Sounds familiar, right? And he sent them out to Germany and to Italy to fight National Socialism, fascism. And these paid professional revolutionaries, they went out under the banner of the Anti-Fascist Action Group, or ANTIFA for short. So if you ever wondered where Antifa came from, it came from Stalin. Anyway, I'm going to take the history, the short history, and end it there, and I'll tell this story again later in another format. But I wanted to get the word out that communism had a global component. Now, there were other variants of socialism and communism. And by the way, it's enough to make your head pop. But just a real quick dive, just to take all this back to its original roots. The term left wing and right wing. Any guess where they come from? My brilliant wife the other day got me real good. She explained that it referred to the airplane. And I was left speechless. At any rate, left wing and right wing really refer to the French Revolution. Right wingers were in support of the monarchy and the church, while left wingers were in support of revolution. And that's where those two terms come from. So no bearing on what we think of left wing and right wing today. Totally different in Europe. And that connotation in Europe was sustained throughout the ages. Right wing really was in support of the monarchies in the various countries. Well, let's fast forward to today and just say that there are many different forms of communism and socialism. As a matter of fact, the global version of communism didn't last much past the Second World War. We're all aware of the Iron Curtain and how Russia was able to take a number of countries in Eastern Europe and make them satellites of the Soviet Union. Well, they did that with the threat that if those countries didn't fall into the communist sphere of Russia, that they were going to fall victim to the rise of neo-Nazi and fascism all over again. That this was the only way to save Europe from the threat of a vitalization of neo-Nazi philosophies and fascist, pro-fascist philosophies. And so the Antifa movement was again brought back to life in order to move global communism throughout the world. Well, there were some chinks in the fence. And the biggest was in Yugoslavia with Marshal Tito. And Tito refused to give over control of his country to Russia. And that really identified the start of what became known as national communism. So you had this friction between Russian-centered global communism and national communism, because then you also had the rise of China as national communists. So nationalism is not something that is strictly thought of with regard to non-communist countries. Nationalism was a threat to Russia and the pure communists in the fact that it was putting up a border, a wall, to the goals of the global communists. And the answer to that was always, if you don't do this, it's going to be fascist regimes that take over. So all the way from the 1920s through to the post-World War II and beyond, the Antifa, the anti-fascist action was always used by the global communists. Well, recently we've had I think, two significant events. In Queens, the primary election saw the primary being won by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and who is an open border socialist / communist. If you say open borders, you're a communist. You're a global communist. And then the second interesting event was the election of Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, who goes by the initials AMLO in Mexico. And Obrador has in his run-up to his election was calling for open migration. He wanted to see as many Mexicans as possible migrate into the United States. Michelle, good morning. Chris, good morning. And he was also willing to help as many people from South America and Central America make the passage into the United States as well. AMLO is a communist. And understand that at the southern Mexico border, there's a wall down there, but it's very porous. But AMLO, in his run up to the election, was saying, if I'm elected, I'm going to help as many people that want to leave Mexico, both Mexicans and others, to go into the United States as possible. That was one of his key platforms. So the point that I wanted to bring out here in giving you the history of communism and talk about the progression of the First International from the 1860s, the Second International, which really consolidated and looked at the form that communism should take, whether it should be from the top down or from the bottom up, and then the third, or the Comintern, the third international grouping of communists after World War I, after the Russian Revolution, that really looked at global communism and what that meant, and how that was the birth of Antifa, how that applies to the movements today with regard to open borders. So when you hear open borders, you have to understand that open borders is a foundational strategy of global communism. And folks, that the people talk about, and this is why I on the 4th of July, I read the Declaration and talked about the implication of the Declaration, why I've laid a lot of the foundations going back to the cornerstone speech of the Confederacy in the 1860s, which was right around the time of the First International in Russia, and how the progressive movement in the United States was tied to those pieces. It's important to understand that open borders is the equivalent of a foundational strategy of communism. And if you have individuals, whether it be outsiders like Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador in Mexico, or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in Queens calling for open borders, or anybody else, she's just the most recent. But those are anti-foundational efforts designed to wear away and create absolute transformational change as it relates to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Whew, that was a long story. We're going to have more as I work over the coming weeks and months going forward to piece together how all this ties into what we see today in terms of marketing. Because, again, it's important to understand that the modern public relations focus, the modern marketing focus, was really designed by Edward Bernays. And Edward Bernays, even though he was born in 1891, he lived a very long time. He lived until 1995. His impact on what we know is public relations and marketing today is mind-boggling. And Bernays, while not necessarily a communist, Bernays was a totalitarian. And Bernays was the one, back in 1928, that coined the term the invisible government, what we call the deep state today. Bernays also identified that in order for his market-centric version of totalitarianism to work, that it would also require control of the media. And how did he identify the media? He identified the media as the executive branch of the deep state. Again, we're talking 1928. So we're going to dig into these in future conversations, but I wanted to again start to tie together a number of the previous videos that I've done, so that as we go forward, it starts to come together. By the way, most of this I've written. I'm in the process. This is going into a book, and this is my chance to talk it out loud. So I appreciate anybody that's watching either live, Nick, Chris, Michelle, and Chris Reneski, if you're still there, and because it's given me a chance to both write and speak it, so I can logically put the components together. But we are going all the way back in order to understand this to the French Revolution, and understand the timeline. Because in order to know where we're going and where we are today, we have to know where we came from. And so with that, I'm going to leave you with my two hashtags. Think liberty, think freedom.